Every year, on the night of Epiphany Eve, cloaked in the darkness, an old woman riding a broom flies the Italian skies, busy delivering gifts to children throughout the peninsula. She's the Befana. Italian kids are all well aware of it, and just can't wait for this time of the year to come. They hung an empty stocking at their fireplace because they know the Befana will enter their homes from the chimney. And there she comes, all covered in soot. She brings sweets to good children, and lumps of black coal to naughty children. Oh, sometimes she might also bring toys. And this is just what happened this year when she brought me this policeman figure I used for this project. But let's see how I made this figure fit better the whole Befana theme. First, I needed a quick and effective solution to hide his uniform, so I asked myself, what is the most simple item of clothing mankind have ever made? A poncho? That's right, I would go for a poncho, but with some modifications. Definitely nothing too crazy though. I was much inspired by the clothing of Mortal Kombat's characters Scorpion and Sub-Zero while cutting the fabric. I left the poncho a bit longer than usual, making it almost looking like a skirt. And I was quite happy with the result actually. And plus, this fabric really resembles a thick winter garment, just proper for a character like the Befana. Using that same thick black fabric, I also made a cloak for the figure to be later attached to the dress, perhaps via a couple of cloak clasps. The upgrading process of the policeman went on with some clay modeling. I used milliput clay to modify his boots. I applied most of the clay on the front of the figure's shins, and mostly using my wet fingers, I patiently pushed the clay towards the back. All around the shins, try to accomplish a seamless transition between the clay and the boots. I made the end of the boots pointy in an attempt to make the character look more spooky. And at one point I just stopped, knowing I could do all the final smoothing with ultra-fine grit sandpaper once the clay had dried. And just like the boots, the gloves of the biker got the same treatment. I elongated them and made them pointy. I like to work the clay using a rolling pin technique rather than scraping away clay from the surface. This way I have more control and I can keep a smooth surface at the same time. When it comes to cut the clay, I like to use a sharp, wet tool, so to make as little resistance as possible against the blade. And voila! As soon as the clay dried up, I painted the figure in glossy black. I was so excited I just couldn't wait to see the result. It was the dramatic face sculpt of this Befana doll that inspired the head of the character. In traditional Italian iconography, the Befana is portrayed like a hag wearing a black shawl. Sometimes though, she is depicted wearing the iconic, pointy witch hat, just like the doll I have. To have a better idea of what I was about to sculpt, I first made a rough sketch of how I imagined the witch's head to be, although the flatness of the doodle only gave me a rough idea really. So I decided to take modeling clay and make a big size 3D template of the head. My idea was to first sculpt a large size concept of the Befana's head, to later model a smaller one in milliput clay, in scale with the policeman figure. But later on, I changed my mind and started to love the idea of modeling a head of exaggerated proportions for the character. I figured that it could not necessarily be the actual head of the character, but rather a helmet of some sort, like Darth Vader's, meant to increase the spookiness of the character. Kind of like what happens with awesome Papua New Guinea's mudmen.
Oh, real spooky.
After all, we've all seen big-headed figures looking cool, so why don't give it a try, I say. I then started preparing the head to make an exact duplicate of it in resin. To make a lighter cast, and also to save up resin, I cut the head into 3 separate pieces and removed as much clay as I could from the inside of every part. Don't forget to smear the walls of the mold with mold release wax. This is fundamental since the silicone rubber loves to stick to cardboard. I prepared the 3 different molds to cast the 3 parts separately. The molds I prepared are called one-piece molds, meaning that the model is fully covered by one single chunk of silicone rubber. This silicone rubber needs to be mixed with its hardener at a 5% ratio. The model was positioned upside down on the bottom of the box, in a way which I believe to be the best for the silicone rubber to rise up real smoothly without encountering major obstacles that could cause air bubbles to be trapped in. Given the complexity of this first piece, which had many details and quite a few undercuts, I poured the silicone rubber in really small amounts, being extremely careful in pouring it from bottom up, paying attention not to directly hit the model with the rubber, tilting the box in all directions to prevent air bubbles to remain trapped into the undercuts of the model. Compared to that first one, pouring silicone rubber in the other 2 molds was really a piece of cake. And also very easy was the deboxing process of the middle section of the hat. Only needed a bit of strength to pull out the clay really. The tip of the hat was also no problemo at all. One-piece molds are also called cut molds, meaning that you literally have to cut your way into the silicone rubber to get to the model. And you want to do it performing a cut in a zigzag fashion like this, so that when you close the mold back to pour the resin inside, the 2 edges will stick to one another real tight, like the teeth of a bear trap. The third piece, the actual head of the model, was very hard to pull out from the mold because all of its undercuts. The soft clay didn't hold its shape and deformed. But that was not a problem since by then I already had what I wanted, a mold to reproduce it in hard resin. I have been working a lot with this Italian resin lately. It's got 2 components to mix together in a 1:1 ratio. Very easy to use and with a relatively fast setting. Pouring the resin into the 2 smaller molds was quite easy. When pouring the resin into the bigger one though, the more complex one, I did it little by little, tilting the mold in all directions after each pour and trying to make the resin reach all the crevices first. Each time I prepare a batch of resin, I totally eyeball the amount I need. I have learned to always keep some extra molds on the side to empty my cup from the exceeding resin. I can get hemispherical bits from this mold and small button-like bits from this other mold I made myself. You can also make a mold that allows you to reproduce one of the coolest bits you have ever come across, one that you know you're not likely to find again, over and over and over. The demolding process was obviously the most satisfactory one, the one step I was mostly looking forward to get to, as you can imagine. The middle part and the tip of the hat being, as always, the easiest to deal with relatively few flesh to remove. The head instead, being now made of hard resin, unlike the clay, would not deform, and it had been definitely more of a pain to remove. When I removed it from the silicone mold, I was simply thrilled. I had never made a one-piece mold before, and I was so excited with that clean result. Only an air bubble on her lip. I would have much preferred a wart, but I got a bubble instead. Everything still fit well together. I only had to fill the gaps in between the sections and give a sand to smoothen everything out. The head, just like the body of the figure, was first given a coat of primer and then spray painted with regular hardware store glossy black. Once I was done with the body and the head of the figure, it was just about time to go on and glue the garment on it. I'm very happy with how this fabric looks like, thick and opaque, which is a nice contrast with the glossy black. There was no need to use needle nor thread in putting together this fabric. Being it completely synthetic, CA glue worked like a charm on it, melting together the strips I overlapped. Within a matter of minutes, I was able to glue the poncho to the figure and the cloak to the poncho, in a fashion which I'm mostly satisfied with. This black flat shoelace was much more than I could ever hope to find to make a belt for the figure. Building models out of junk taught me two important things. 1. Rather than thinking, spend much time observing, growing an eye which is able to spot a belt buckle in a door. And 2. I must always have moisturizing lotion at my fingertips. Wrapping the belt around the figure's waist was most satisfactory. The buckle was then glued to the garment with a few super glue drops right behind it. And as a final touch, I used a broken Lego part to make the end tip of the belt. Because this Befana is ultimately really fashionable.
Hey, I'm the Befana. If next year you want me to bring you candies and not black coal, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel and share this content.
Thank you. As for the speeder, one of my first ideas was to convert the classic broom that the Befana rides into some sort of sci-fi vacuum cleaner speeder. But somehow the idea was soon put aside, and I started playing around with the looks of superbikes. I like the outline of their fairings, and I like how it is still possible to admire a fair amount of mechanics in these motorbikes. Looking through my scraps and toys, I found something very close to what I was looking for. This is a 1986 Coleco Starcom Shadow Bat I picked long ago at a street sale, with most of its functions still working. Although this one is missing both the flank cannons that open with a spring mechanism. I thought the shape of this toy to be just suitable for what I had in mind, and so decided to sacrifice it for a scratch building project. This toy had plenty of cool detailed bits for me to harvest and use in future builds. Inside the cockpit I also found a very cool double seat. Too bad it seems like I don't have any figure that fit in. Basically, I only kept the empty hull of the aircraft to use for this project. The plan was actually very simple: sealing both cockpits with super glue and baking powder, and cut off both wings to turn the aircraft into a super aerodynamic vehicle.
Hey then, what do you think you're doing, you toy butcher?
Don't you worry, it's gonna look great. The front of the aircraft started to look like a black raven with its pointy beak, which I thought it fit just perfectly the overall theme. After removing the wings, I was left with long gaps on both sides of the hull to fill, and also the bottom of the speeder was wide opened since I removed the ramp. The idea that made me smile was to build a big rotating turbine-like engine to be placed in the empty hull of the aircraft. All the parts of the engine would be kept into place by a long bamboo stick. I would keep the bottom of the aircraft opened so that the engine would still be visible. And as for the long gaps on the sides of the aircraft, I made those openings even wider and used corrugated conduit to fill them. With the pipes into place, the model really started to come together, and I was super happy with it. But I wanted the engine not only to be visible, but also to become one of the striking details of the build. So I took my Dremel again and made openings on both sides of the model. Openings that revealed gaps that had to be filled with milliput clay. The pipes weren't enough to fill up the voids, I needed some other bits to complete the job. These fantastic parts have a lot of potential in my opinion. They are themselves a mine of interesting little parts. And to think that terrestrials use these to hang flower pots with.
What a
the
waste!
Hook had the perfect tapered end I was looking for. To fill the void in the very front of the speeder, I used some bit that might have been some sort of knob or switch. It not only had a triangular shape, but it also connected perfectly with one of the pegs already existing on the model. Only had to taper it a little, and it fit just fine. With this other bit, the origins of which are most obscure, I made a saddle for the figure. The gap filling process just never ended, and I had 2 more areas to cover still. Screw housings ravaged from the case of an electrical appliance made cool details on the sides of the speeder, while custom cut sheets of really thin plastic were perfect to cover the holes in the very back, right where the figure sits. I tried real hard to make them look like panels that had always been there. The thruster had been a bit of a pain. I made quite a few versions of it, but they all looked extremely steampunkish, so not at all cohesive with the rest of the build. Until I found this bit, a casing of a broken USB charger that struck me with its simplicity. I tried to make it look more convincing by gluing a series of trapezoidal sprues on a slightly convex bit. The handbars of the speeder were crafted bending a pretty thick aluminum rod that fit exactly the figure's hand, and connected to the speeder via cuts from a leftover bit I used in the previous project to make Krulo's common tower. Using cuts from an ink printer part and chromed bits from a vintage toy, I managed to make a pair of footrests for the figure, to be poked on the sides of the speeder. Time for details. Both sides of the Black Raven's beak were brought to the same level of the pipes with bits cut from the guardrails of a toy track race that had the exact same angle. The Starcom toy already had quite a few surface details and paneling. I reckoned no more details were needed on that. The engine, on the other hand, did need a few gribblings. After upgrading it with a series of cable ties, I started gluing on it a series of bits harvested from what I believe to have been a roller shutter. All the components were then given a coat of black primer and painted separately. The body of the Black Raven was painted in glossy black, the engine, along with the handlebars and footrests, was given a chromed finish, and the thruster was painted with a bolt gun metal.